Okay, so we are here again. We're going to talk about legal and ethical aspects of older adult care, things that you need to be aware of. We're just going to cover these all pretty briefly, but you'll want to, especially if you work with older adults, you'll get more training on these aspects, but you definitely need to be aware of all of them. So first of all, we want to talk about some healthcare and insurance options that are out there. In the United States, healthcare has always been a purchase service and not a right. That means that we pay for the healthcare that we ask for. We don't have it offered to us for free by the government. In other countries, nearly all other countries, the government pays for health care, but you may have to wait a specified amount of time or an unknown amount of time before you can have certain things like elective surgeries taken care of. So if you tear your ACL, you may be on crutches and in a knee brace for 3 or 4 months before they will actually do the surgery to repair that ACL. And that wait time comes because they have individuals who need services, and they only have as many physicians as they have that the government's going to help pay for and take care of. So in the United States, this has been different than other countries. So the federal government does provide some care to certain individuals through insurance plans, and they're listed here: Medicare, Railroad Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, and the Veterans Administration care. Medicare, first of all, historically, in the 1930s, President Roosevelt started a Social Security bill that was initially meant to help with Social Security funds when people retire, but also to provide health care plans. Because there was so much opposition to it, Roosevelt pulled the health insurance part of the bill and kept just the Social Security part, or retirement plans. And so the Social Security Act was established in 1935 as a result. In the 1960s, President Johnson proposed amendments to the Social Security Act, and that resulted in the establishment of Medicare, Railroad Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, there are multiple components of Medicare today: Part A, B, C, and D. We're going to focus on Part A, but realize that the other parts all take care of certain aspects as well, and you have to pay monthly fees, deductibles, and co-pays, depending on what type you have and how much coverage it applies. So when a person here in the United States turns 65, they are eligible to receive Medicare Part A coverage automatically, but they have to go and sign up for it. They do need to have paid some Medicare taxes for about 10 years. But there are some caveats in there. So if you have your grandma was a stay-at-home mom and didn't actually work, she get apply for Medicare Part A under her spouse. So there are monthly fees and then deductibles. That'll depend on what type you sign up under, and then there's also co-pays that apply. People who are blind and totally disabled and individuals with end-stage renal disease can also sign up for Medicare Part A. Part A covers health insurance, or covers acute hospital care and short-term rehabilitation care. Some costs related to hospice and home health care under certain circumstances. You see, this is really just acute care and short-term rehab. It doesn't cover prescriptions. It doesn't cover vision, glasses. It doesn't cover hearing aids. It doesn't cover walkers, crutches, other types of devices that you might need to support your care. Some of the other components of Medicare will cover those. Of course, they're an additional monthly fee, additional deductibles, and copays as well. Care for Veterans through the VA system has held a pretty long leadership position, and they've done pretty well with health care for older adults. Persons who have been part of uniformed services and their dependents may be eligible for healthcare services through the VA network. This insurance program is provided by the Department of Defense, and there's no charges related to it. It does require that you also enroll in Medicare Part A and Part B and pay those premiums. And that Medigap policy or TRICARE for Life is part of the Part B of Medicare, and those expenses, it covers those expenses that aren't covered by Medicare, like copays, prescription medicines, and such. Medicaid is jointly funded by federal and state governments, and it uses some of our tax dollars to provide general funds for each. It provides services for low-income children, pregnant women, those who are permanently disabled, and persons who are 65 and older. The majority of these funds are used to provide long-term nursing care for older and disabled adults. So long-term care, skilled nursing, dementia units. It also will cover some long-term care services in the home and community settings, like homemakers or home health aides, that type of thing. The states really have a lot of say in what it will cover in the state that you reside in, and it can change quite a bit from state to state. We also want to talk about some other legal and ethical issues, such as decision making and autonomy. So we know we have an ethical principle of autonomy, allowing individuals to make reasoned, informed choices, and that informed consent for any procedures or treatments has come about as a result of understanding that respect for autonomy, so that people can make a good choice for their health care depending on the education they get in that informed consent. There's a couple of different terms you want to understand. Competence is a legal term, indicates that the individual has the capacity to make a decision. Capacity is a term that says that they can understand at a level needed for that decision to be made. We're also going to talk about some advanced directive components, and there's several, and they can be just a tad confusing. So read up on these and differentiate just a bit. We'll talk more about some of these later on in the semester. But initially we want to talk about power of attorney. There are really two types of power of attorney. One is a general power of attorney that is designated by an individual, and they take care of business matters, finances, and things like that. Healthcare power of attorney is a person who's designated to make healthcare decisions for an individual that can't make them for themselves. Both cases, it would be a person who can no longer make those decisions for themselves. And in both cases, the intent is that that individual who's designated as a power of attorney is willing to uphold the wishes of the person, but we may or may not know what those wishes are, or if they are actually upholding them. Once they're designated as a power of attorney, they have the right to sign informed consents, to make decisions related to health care if they have a healthcare power of attorney, to make decisions related to finances if they have just a regular power of attorney. You might also see a guardian or a conservator. Conservator is another word of the person who controls the finances, and a guardian is the person who provides care, manages personal health care aspects for that individual who can no longer do so. Elder mistreatment is a complex phenomenon that involves elder abuse, exploitation, and neglect. It's found in all socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic groups. It can be intentional, accidental, episodic, or recurrent. And we have two acts, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act and the Vulnerable Elder Rights Act, that help protect individuals from mistreatment. Abuse occurs most often in the home setting where the caregiving occurs, and physical abuse is the most common type of abuse that we'll find, and it is the use of any physical force that results in body injury, pain, or impairment. So you might see unexpected bruises, you might see changes in behavior. It can also include inappropriate use of chemical, which would be drugs, to restrain a person, physical restraints, force feeding, and physical punishment. So physical punishment could be spankings, it could be withholding food. I know the cases we see in the news are really extreme cases where somebody was put in the dog kennel for hours and hours on end, or left outside tied to a chair in the backyard. And those are super extreme. Usually what you're going to find is someone who starts to shy away when the care provider or maybe anyone raises their hand to wash their face because they've been struck. Or we might find bruises that don't have a reason for them. Every time the resident goes with family members, and then they come back to a facility, they end up with a new bruise the next day. Things like that can be a little easier type of abuse to identify. All abuse ends up getting investigated. Psychological or emotional abuse are things like verbal assaults, threats, intimidation, humiliation, and harassment. And it can be verbal or nonverbal. So treating someone like a child, socially isolating them and not letting them see other family members, friends, or anyone. Those are good examples. It's important that we can identify these. They're a little bit harder to identify. And then financial or material exploitation is another type of abuse. It's the improper use of another person's funds, property, identity, or assets. And it can be by force, by deceit, by fraud, and it can be very difficult to detect. The hotline number in Missouri is listed here, and it's on another slide as well. And if you have concerns, then you can either call on your own or ask for some advice from a supervisor or someone else you trust, and then perhaps they can help you make a call. Caregiver neglect and self-neglect are two other types that we need to address. So caregiver neglect is when a person withholds needed goods or services like food, medication, medical treatment, or ignores obvious needs even when, let's say, the caregiver's present but they're not attending to those obvious needs. So if an older adult is soiled, and they're soiled for a significant amount of time, if an older adult has stool on their hands because they've tried to clean themselves up, even things like not providing medication that they can get easy access to, or food that they can get access to. Undue influence is like the financial neglect. They use their role or power to exploit that individual. And self-neglect is really the most common, and it's when a person has the capacity to care for themselves, but they don't, and so they become malnourished, dehydrated. They start to neglect grooming. They don't go to the doctor when they have medical conditions that they need to go to. And self-neglect is one of the most common types, and it can also be difficult to address. And it's even harder because the person has the capacity to understand. They just choose not to, usually because they're feeling hopeless or depressed and feel like it's just their time to die, or maybe they want to die. Hoarding is another type of um, abuse that we can see. It's a self type of abuse, or it could happen in families as well. It affects about 6.2 million people in the United States over the age of 55. The specific dangers to older adults, as you can probably imagine, increased risk of falls, unsanitary conditions, and it can indicate dementia or cognitive decline. So, to diagnose this, the person basically has to have or demonstrate ongoing difficulty of letting go of personal possessions, strong urges to save things, distress at throwing things out, and then these symptoms lead to this level of clutter in the home or office that makes the building unusable. It's definitely is a psychological disorder and can't be attributed to any other medical condition or disorder. So who's vulnerable for abuse? Single women over the age of 75, if they live alone or with the abuser, if they're physically disabled or frail, if they're incontinent, if they're mentally or cognitively disabled, and if they're dependent on the abuser. The typical abuser, however, is usually a family member, often a middle-aged individual. They may have a history of mental illness or substance abuse. They could be financially dependent on the abused. They may have a history of being abused or abusing others, and a lot of times it's just plain an exhausted or frustrated caregiver. If you were asked to, bump up, who's the person who's most at risk or most likely an abuser, you want to start adding these things up, and that'll give you your component. No one is going to be worse than another, but when you start adding 3 or 4 of these in together, then the risk raises. Again, your mandatory reporting information. Anytime you have a reason to believe that abuse has occurred, you should report it. The nice thing is that you're not making the decision. You call the number, they take your information, and they make the decision. They will log if a report has been made, even if it is an unfounded report, so that if several unfounded reports have been made on the same individual, then we can start to see a pattern. And then you don't get involved in the rest of the investigation. They take it from there, but they will eventually send you a letter, or you might receive a phone call that'll let you know whether the report was founded or unfounded. So it'll say something like, you reported an incident of abuse on such and such a date, and that case has been founded or unfounded. If it was unfounded, that means nothing has been done other than logging that a report has been filed. If it was founded, then actions have occurred, but you won't know what those are. So here's a good question. Which of the following patients is at risk for elder abuse? We have a 96-year-old female living with an adult daughter and her grandson who has bipolar disorder, an 88-year-old male living at home without any family, a 90-year-old male incontinent of urine and stool living with a son and his wife, a 67-year-old female living alone who attends adult daycare activities, or a 62-year-old female with dementia who lives in a retirement community and her children visit several times a week. So we can get rid of, while this person, 62 in letter E, has dementia, that's the only risk there. So we can cross that one out. The 67-year-old female living alone has some risk, but even the 90-year-old male incontinent of urine and stool raises his risk level up a little bit more. But your most significant risk here would be the 96-year-old female. She's older than 65. She's living with a person who has a mental health disorder. And so that raises the risk more. So that is the end of this part of the lecture. Be sure to watch the other two portions of your lecture as well.